She smiled as she drank the silver poison. Only then did the Alpha King realize he had killed his true mate. The council hall went silent the moment the bond snapped into place. Kael Ashgrave felt it before he understood it, a pull behind his ribs so sudden and so strong that his glass cracked in his hand. Every wolf in the room turned toward the doorway, where a small woman in a plain grey cloak stood frozen, her eyes wide with confusion. She had only come to deliver herbs for the pack healer. She had not come to change her life forever. Kael rose from his chair, his jaw tight, his golden eyes locked on her as if she had personally wronged him. He did not smile. He did not soften. He simply stared at her the way a man stares at a debt he never wanted to owe. Her name was Wren Calloway. She had grown up outside the park, raised by a human ant in a small village at the edge of the northern woods, and she had never asked to be noticed by wolves, let alone claimed by their king. But the moment his eyes met hers, something ancient and unbreakable locked between them, and every wolf in the hall could smell it on the air. Mate. No, Kael said, before anyone else could speak. His voice was flat, final, the voice of a man used to being obeyed. This is a mistake. Wren said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence protected her better than words ever could. The beta, Draven, stepped forward with a look of practiced concern, though something colder moved behind his eyes. My king, the bond does not lie. Whether you accept her or not, she is now tied to the throne. Kael's hands curled into fists. He had spent years preparing himself for a mate who could stand beside him in battle, someone bred for power, someone the pack would respect without question. Instead, fate had handed him a healer's assistant with trembling hands and eyes that flinched at raised voices. Take her to the east wing, he said, turning away as though she were a piece of furniture to be placed out of sight. She stays. She does not speak for the throne. She does not sit beside me. She is nothing more than what the bond demands. The words landed on Wren like stones, but she did not cry. She lifted her chin instead, and though her heart pounded with fear, she followed the guards without protest, refusing to give the room the satisfaction of watching her break. That night, alone in a cold stone room far from the warmth of the main hall, Wren sat by the window and stared out at the dark forest below. She did not understand wolves, their laws, their bonds, or their cruelty, but she understood pain, and she understood how quickly people could decide someone was unworthy of kindness. She had not asked for this crown. She had not asked for this king. And yet here she was, trapped in a world that already hated her before she had spoken a single word in her own defense. Days passed, and Kael made no effort to hide his contempt. He avoided her at meals, spoke to her only when pack law required it, and made certain the entire court understood that she held no real place in his life. Servants whispered when she passed. Warriors smirked. The pack matriarch, a sharp-eyed woman named Elspeth, watched her with quiet calculation, as though trying to determine the fastest way to remove an obstacle from a chessboard. Only one person showed Wren anything close to warmth. Ivy Marsh, a young healer who worked in the herb rooms beneath the manor, offered her a small smile the first time they met, and later, a cup of tea when the halls felt too cold and too lonely. You mustn't let them see you flinch, Ivy said one evening, handing her a warm cup. Wolves respect strength, even when they refuse to admit it. I'm not a wolf, Wren said quietly. I don't think I have that kind of strength. Ivy studied her for a long moment. You have a different kind. The kind that survives when no one is cheering for you. Wren wanted to believe her, but every day in the manor chipped away at whatever confidence she tried to hold on to. She began to help in the healer's wing without being asked, tending to injured pack members who did not know what to make of a human-born healer with gentle hands and quiet patience. Slowly, some of the younger wolves started to trust her, even as the higher ranks continued to treat her like an unwanted stain on the pack's pride. Kael noticed the change among his warriors, the way some of them spoke of her with grudging respect, and it only deepened his irritation. He had built his reputation on strength, on certainty, and now his own bondmate was quietly earning loyalty he had never given her permission to seek. One evening, he found her in the healer's wing, sleeves rolled up, hands steady as she wrapped a wand on a young wolf's arm. He watched from the doorway, arms crossed, jaw tense. You are not here to play healer, he said coldly. You are here because the bond demands your presence, nothing more. Ren did not look up. Then let the bond demand it in silence. I would rather be useful than invisible. Her calm response struck something in him, though he refused to acknowledge it. Instead, he turned and walked away, telling himself her defiance meant nothing. But it did mean something, and that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. That night, Draven found Kael alone in his study, staring into the fire with an unreadable expression. You should be careful, my king, Draven said carefully. She grows more popular among the young wolves each day. Some already whisper that she should have a voice in council matters. Kael's eyes narrowed. She will have no voice. The bond does not grant her power. It only grants her a claim I never asked for. Draven allowed a small, satisfied smile to pass over his face before schooling his features back into concern. Of course, my king. I only wish to protect your authority. But authority was not what Draven wished to protect. He wished to protect his own path to the throne, a path that had existed long before Ren Calloway ever walked into the council hall, and one he had no intention of losing to a human healer with no claim to power beyond an unwanted bond. As the days turned into weeks, the distance between Kael and Ren grew wider, filled with cold silences and unspoken resentment. Ren told herself she did not need his approval, that she could build a quiet life within the healer's wing regardless of his cruelty. But some nights, alone in her cold room, she pressed a hand to her chest and wondered why the bond ached so fiercely when the man attached to it wanted nothing to do with her. She did not yet know that somewhere in the shadows of the manor, a plan had already begun to take shape, one built on ambition and cruelty, one that would use her isolation and Kael's coldness as the perfect cover for something far darker than rejection. For now, she only knew the sting of being unwanted, the ache of a bond that promised everything and delivered nothing, and the quiet resolve to keep standing even when the ground beneath her felt like it could give way at any moment. She had survived worse than cold silence before. She told herself she could survive this too. She had no way of knowing how wrong that hope would prove to be. Winter settled over the manor like a slow, creeping frost, and with it came a cruelty that grew sharper by the day. Ren had hoped that time might soften Kael's resentment, but instead it seemed to harden into something colder and more deliberate. He no longer simply ignored her. He began to use her as an example, a lesson to the pack in what happened to those who tried to rise above their place. At a winter feast meant to honor the pack's strongest warriors, Kael made a point of sitting Ren at the farthest end of the hall, far from the high table where tradition demanded a mate should sit. When one of the older wolves questioned the arrangement, Kael answered loud enough for the entire hall to hear. She sits where she belongs, he said. The bond gave her a claim to my life. It did not give her a claim to my respect. Laughter rippled through parts of the hall, though not everyone joined in. Some of the younger warriors, the ones Ren had quietly helped in the healer's wing, exchanged uncomfortable glances but said nothing, afraid to challenge their king in front of the entire pack. Ren sat with her spine straight and her eyes fixed on her plate, refusing to let the sting reach her face. She had learned to build walls quickly in her life, and she built another one that night, brick by brick, around the part of her heart that still foolishly hoped for kindness. Elspeth, the pack matriarch, watched the exchange with quiet approval. She had never wanted a human born mate diluting the bloodline of the throne, and Kael's cruelty served her purposes perfectly. If the king humiliated her enough, perhaps the girl would live on her own, sparing everyone the complications of a forced removal. But Draven had grown impatient with waiting for humiliation to do its work. He wanted certainty, not possibility, and certainty required a different kind of plan. It began small, almost unnoticeable. A slight change in the taste of Ren's tea, a faint metallic note she assumed came from the mineral water drawn from the eastern wells. She said nothing, not wanting to draw attention to herself in a place where attention only ever seemed to invite cruelty. Within days, she noticed a strange fatigue settling into her bones, a heaviness that made even simple tasks in the healer's wing feel exhausting. Ivy noticed it too, her brow furrowing with concern as she watched Ren's hands tremble while grinding herbs. You look pale, Ivy said, setting down her mortar and pestle. Have you been sleeping? Not well, Ren admitted. But it's nothing. Probably the cold. Ivy did not look convinced, but she let the matter rest, unaware of how quickly the truth would reveal itself to be far more dangerous than winter weather. Meanwhile, Kael's cruelty continued unchecked, fed by his own wounded pride and by whispers from those who wished to keep Ren isolated. He told himself that his coldness was simply practical, a way of protecting the throne from complications he had never asked for. He refused to examine why her quiet dignity in the face of his cruelty unsettled him more than outright anger ever could. One evening, he passed the healer's wing and paused at the sound of soft laughter. Through the doorway, he saw Ren sitting among several young pack members, wrapping a bandage around a child's arm while telling a story that made the children giggle despite their injuries. For a moment, something in his chest loosened, a warmth he did not want to acknowledge. Then Draven appeared beside him, his voice low and deliberate. "The pack grows fond of her, my king. Some already speak of her as though she carries more authority than her position allows." The warmth in Kael's chest turned cold again, replaced by suspicion. "She has no authority. She has a bond, nothing more." "Of course," Draven said smoothly. "But bonds have a way of growing roots, if left unchecked." Kael said nothing more, but that night, he ordered new restrictions. Ren was no longer permitted to tend to pack members outside the healer's wing. She was forbidden from attending council meetings, even as an observer. Her movements within the manor were quietly monitored, though no one dared call it what it truly was. Ren accepted each new restriction with the same quiet dignity she had shown from the beginning, though the walls around her grew smaller and colder with each passing week. She began to feel like a ghost haunting a house that had never wanted her, present but unseen, alive but unacknowledged. Her fatigue worsened. Some mornings, she woke with her hands trembling so badly she could barely hold a cup. Other days, dizziness swept over her without warning, forcing her to grip the nearest wall to keep from falling. She told herself it was exhaustion, or perhaps the cold northern air disagreeing with a body raised in warmer villages. She did not want to believe anything worse, because believing something worse meant admitting she had no one in this manor who would truly help her. Ivy grew increasingly worried, though she could not pinpoint the cause of Ren's decline. She began quietly testing different herbs, hoping to strengthen Ren's condition, unaware that the source of the sickness lay not in nature, but in deliberate cruelty hidden inside her nightly tea. Draven had grown careful, administering the poison slowly, in small enough doses to avoid suspicion, but steadily enough to ensure a gradual decline that could easily be mistaken for illness, heartbreak, or simple human frailty. He knew that a sudden death would raise questions. A slow fading, however, would raise only sympathy, followed swiftly by relief. Meanwhile, Kael's own inner conflict deepened, though he refused to name it. He found himself watching Ren from a distance more often than he wanted to admit, noting the way she never begged for his attention, never groveled for his approval, never once tried to manipulate the bond to gain favor. Instead, she simply endured, quietly and without complaint, and something about her resilience gnawed at him in ways he could not explain. One night, unable to sleep, he wandered the halls and found himself standing outside her door. He told himself he had come to reinforce the restrictions, to remind her of her place. But when he raised his hand to knock, he heard a soft, pained sound from within, followed by the unmistakable noise of someone catching themselves against the wall. He pushed the door open without thinking, and found Ren kneeling on the floor, one hand braced against the stone, her face pale and damp with sweat. For a moment, concern flickered across his features, quick and involuntary, before he caught himself and hardened his expression again. "What is this?" he demanded, though his voice lacked its usual coldness. "It's nothing," Ren said, forcing herself upright despite the way the room seemed to tilt around her. "Just a dizzy spell. I am fine." Kael studied her for a long moment, torn between suspicion and something he refused to call worry. "You will see Ivy in the morning," he said finally, his tone clipped. "I won't have illness spreading through my healer's wing." It was not kindness. It was practicality, or so he told himself as he turned and left without another word. But long after he returned to his own chambers, the image of her trembling on the floor lingered in his mind, refusing to fade. The following morning, Ivy examined Ren carefully, checking her pulse, her eyes, the color beneath her nails. She found nothing definitive, only a vague pattern of symptoms that could point to exhaustion, poor nutrition, or something far more sinister that she could not yet name. "I want you to rest," Ivy said firmly. "No more work in the healer's wing until you're stronger." Ren nodded, too tired to argue, though something inside her whispered that rest alone would not fix whatever was slowly unraveling within her body. Unbeknownst to both of them, a visiting healer from a neighboring park had arrived that same week to consult with Elspeth on unrelated matters. His name was Corwin, an older wolf with sharp instincts honed by decades of experience. While passing through the healer's wing, he caught the faint scent lingering on Ren's skin, a scent so subtle that only a trained nose would recognize it. He said nothing to Ren, not wanting to alarm her without certainty, but he sought out Kael that same evening, requesting a private audience. "My king," Corwin said carefully, once they were alone, "I do not wish to overstep, but I caught a scent on your maid that concerns me deeply. It carries traces of Silverwolf's bane, faint but unmistakable to a trained healer." Kael's expression darkened, though not with worry, but with irritation at what he assumed was another attempt to elevate Ren's importance within the pack. "Silverwolf's bane requires deliberate exposure. Are you suggesting someone within my own manor is poisoning my mate?" "I am suggesting," Corwin said carefully, "that the possibility should not be dismissed." Kael's jaw tightened. He thought of Draven's careful words, of Elspeth's quiet disapproval, but he also thought of his own resentment toward Ren, and how easily that resentment could be manipulated by those seeking to justify her removal from the manor entirely. "I will look into it," Kael said finally, though his tone lacked urgency. Corwin left the conversation uneasy, sensing that his warning had landed on ears too clouded by pride and suspicion to act with the urgency the situation required. That night, Ren lay awake in her cold room, staring at the ceiling, wondering if her body was simply giving up under the weight of loneliness, or if something darker moved beneath the surface of her illness. She thought of Ivy's concern, of Kael's brief, unexpected moment of worry, and of the quiet ache in her chest that refused to fade no matter how many walls she built around her heart. She did not yet know that a warning had been given and dismissed, that a poison moved quietly through her veins with deliberate patience, or that the very throne meant to protect her had already begun failing her in ways far more dangerous than cold words and empty seats at feasts. She only knew that she was tired, that she was alone, and that some quiet part of her had begun to wonder how much longer she could keep pretending that surviving was the same thing as living. The days that followed brought a strange calm to the manor, the kind of calm that settles just before a storm breaks. Ren's fatigue did not fade, no matter how much rest Ivy insisted she take. If anything, it deepened, spreading through her limbs like a slow, invisible weight that made even simple movements feel like wading through deep water. She began hiding it better, forcing brightness into her voice when servants passed, steadying her hands before anyone could notice their trembling. She had learned that weakness in this manner was not met with sympathy but with opportunity, and she refused to give anyone another reason to see her as less than she already was. Kael noticed the change in her, though he told himself it meant nothing. She moved slower through the halls now, her steps careful, deliberate, as though she were constantly bracing herself against some invisible current. Once, he caught her gripping the stair railing longer than necessary, her knuckles pale against the stone, and something uneasy stirred in his chest before he pushed the feeling away. He told himself it was not his concern. He told himself the bond meant nothing beyond duty. But some nights, he found himself listening for the sound of her footsteps in the hall outside his study, and when they did not come, an unfamiliar restlessness kept him awake long after the fire had burned to embers. Draven watched Kael's shifting moods with quiet satisfaction, though he was careful never to let his true intentions show. He had grown confident in his plan, certain that Ren's decline would be attributed to heartbreak, exhaustion, or simple human frailty rather than anything deliberate. Still, he understood the value of patience, and he continued administering small doses of Silverwolf's bane through her nightly tea, careful never to increase the amount too quickly. Elspeth, for her part, had begun to soften slightly in her outward treatment of Ren, though not out of any genuine change of heart. She had realized that overt cruelty risked drawing suspicion should anyone begin asking questions about Ren's health, and so she adopted a strategy of cold indifference instead, distancing herself just enough to avoid blame while allowing Draven's plan to continue unimpeded. Ivy, meanwhile, grew increasingly desperate to understand the source of Ren's decline. She spent long hours in the herb rooms, testing different remedies, comparing symptoms against every illness she had ever studied. Nothing quite matched, and the uncertainty gnawed at her more with each passing day. One evening, while preparing a fresh batch of tea for Ren, Ivy noticed a faint discoloration at the bottom of the previous night's cup, a thin residue that should not have been there. Her breath caught. She had seen that particular discoloration before, during her training years, in a case study on silver wolfsbane poisoning. Her hands trembled as she carefully collected a sample, wrapping it in cloth and tucking it into her satchel. She needed confirmation before raising an alarm that could put her own position at risk, especially if the poisoning traced back to someone with influence within the manor. She sought out Corwin, the visiting healer, hoping his experience could confirm her suspicions. He examined the sample carefully, his expression darkening with each passing moment. "This is silver wolfsbane," he confirmed quietly. "Diluted, administered slowly, likely over several weeks. Someone wanted this to look like natural illness." Ivy's stomach twisted. "We have to tell the king." "I already tried," Corwin said grimly. "He dismissed my warning as pack politics. If we go to him again without undeniable proof, we risk being dismissed a second time, and by then, it may be too late." "Then we need proof," Ivy said, determination hardening her voice. "Real, undeniable proof." They agreed to monitor Wren's tea more closely, testing each batch before it reached her, hoping to catch the poisoner in the act or gather evidence strong enough to force Kael's attention. But even as they made their plans, neither of them realized how quickly Draven would sense their growing suspicion, nor how ruthlessly he would act to protect his secret. Meanwhile, Wren's condition continued to worsen, though she remained determined not to let it show in front of Kael. She had convinced herself that showing weakness would only give him another reason to see her as a burden rather than a mate, and some stubborn part of her refused to hand him that satisfaction. One afternoon, while walking through the manor gardens, she paused beside a frozen fountain, her breath visible in the cold air, her legs suddenly unsteady beneath her. She gripped the stone edge of the fountain, willing the dizziness to pass, when a voice startled her from behind. "You should not be out here alone in this cold." She turned to find Kael standing a short distance away, his expression unreadable, though his eyes lingered on her pale face with something that almost resembled concern. "I needed air," she said simply, straightening despite the effort it cost her. He studied her for a long moment, noting the slight tremor in her hands, the hollow look beneath her eyes. Something in him wanted to ask if she was truly well, but pride and old resentment held the question back. "You look unwell," he said instead, his tone clipped, though quieter than usual. "I'm managing," Wren replied, offering a faint smile that did not reach her eyes. "I always manage." Something about the resignation in her voice unsettled him more than outright accusation would have. He found himself wanting to say something more, something kinder, but the habit of coldness ran too deep, and instead he simply nodded and walked away, leaving her alone beside the frozen fountain once more. Later that evening, Ivy intercepted the tea meant for Wren's chambers, carefully testing it before allowing it to be delivered. The results confirmed her worst fears. The tea carried unmistakable traces of silver wolfsbane, stronger than the sample from the previous night. Panic gripped her chest. The poisoning was accelerating, and she now understood that time had become dangerously short. She rushed to find Corwin, only to discover him in a heated but hushed conversation with Draven near the servants' corridor. She paused just out of sight, straining to hear their words. "The healer grows suspicious," Draven said quietly, his voice tight with irritation. "If she brings undeniable proof to the king, everything falls apart." "Then perhaps it is time to remove the risk entirely," Corwin replied, and for a horrifying moment, Ivy believed she had been betrayed by the one person she thought might help her. But then Corwin continued, his tone sharpening with disgust. "I meant removing you from this manor, before you destroy an innocent life for the sake of ambition. I will not stay silent any longer." Draven's expression twisted with cold calculation. "You will say nothing, old healer, unless you wish to explain to the king why you concealed a foreign poison for this long without proper proof, delaying action while an innocent girl suffered." The threat landed with quiet menace, and Ivy realized with dawning horror that Draven had already begun weaving a narrative that could just as easily incriminate Corwin, buying himself time regardless of what evidence emerged. She retreated quietly before either man noticed her presence, her mind racing. She needed to reach Kael directly, with proof strong enough that he could not dismiss it, and she needed to do it before Draven found a way to silence her as well. That night, she prepared a final test, carefully distilling the poisoned tea into a concentrated sample that left no room for doubt. She planned to present it to Kael first thing in the morning, alongside Cohen's testimony, hoping the combined weight of evidence would finally break through his stubborn resistance. But fate, cruel and unyielding, moved faster than her plans allowed. Ren, unaware of the danger closing in around her, spent that evening alone in her room, staring at the frost gathering on her window. Her body ached in ways she could no longer ignore, and for the first time, a quiet, unwelcome thought crossed her mind: perhaps she was truly dying, and perhaps no one in this manor would care enough to notice until it was too late. She thought of her aunt back in the village, of the life she had left behind for a bond that had brought her nothing but cruelty and isolation. She thought of Kael's brief moments of unexpected concern, quickly buried beneath cold indifference, and wondered if she had imagined warmth where none truly existed. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find a young servant girl holding a tray with her nightly tea, the same tea that had slowly stolen her strength for weeks without her knowledge. "Thank you," Ren said softly, accepting the tray with trembling hands. The servant girl curtsied and hurried away, unaware of the danger she carried, just as Draven had ensured she would be. Ren sat by her window, wrapping her hands around the warm cup, staring out at the moonlit forest beyond the manor walls. She thought about the strange, aching bond that tied her to a man who seemed determined never to accept her, and she wondered, not for the first time, if some connections were simply doomed from the start. She lifted the cup toward her lips, unaware that within its depths lay a concentration of poison far stronger than any dose she had unknowingly consumed before, a final, deliberate escalation meant to bring Draven's plan to its cruel conclusion before Ivy's evidence could reach the throne. Downstairs, in the quiet dark of the manor, Ivy prepared her testimony with careful precision, believing she still had time before morning to save the woman she had come to see as a friend. She did not yet know that time had already run out. The cup trembled slightly in Ren's hands as she brought it to her lips, though the tremor came from her weakened body rather than any hesitation in her heart. She had grown so tired of fighting, so tired of wars and cold silences and a bond that promised everything while delivering nothing, that some quiet, broken part of her welcomed the warmth of the tea as though it were the only comfort left to her in this manner. She drank slowly, savoring the small moment of peace before the ache in her body reasserted itself. She did not know that this cup held far more poison than any before it. She only knew that for the first time in weeks, a strange calm settled over her, as though her body had finally decided to stop resisting the exhaustion that had plagued her for so long. Within minutes, the calm deepened into something heavier, a warm heaviness that spread from her chest outward, dulling the ache in her limbs, softening the edges of her vision. She set the cup down carefully, her hands no longer trembling, and leaned back against her chair with something that almost resembled relief. She smiled softly, unaware that the poison coursing through her veins had finally reached a threshold her body could not survive. In her mind, in that final drifting moment, she thought not of pain or fear, but of quiet release from a life that had offered her so little warmth. She thought of her aunt's garden back home, of sunlight on green leaves, of a simpler time before bonds and thrones and cold manners had complicated everything she once knew. Downstairs, Ivy finished preparing her evidence, her hands steady despite the urgency pounding in her chest. She gathered the concentrated sample, wrapped Cohen's written testimony alongside it, and hurried toward the private wing where Kael remained awake, staring into his fire as he so often did in the quiet hours before dawn. She knocked firmly, refusing to let fear slow her steps any further. "My king, I must speak with you. It concerns your mate's health, and I fear we have very little time." Kael opened the door, his expression tightening with irritation at the late hour, though something in Ivy's frantic tone gave him pause. "Speak quickly, then." "She has been poisoned," Ivy said without preamble, holding out the sample and testimony. "Silverwolf's bane, administered slowly through her tea for weeks. I have proof, and Cohen's testimony confirms it. Someone within this manor has been trying to kill her." For a long moment, Kael simply stared at the evidence in her hands, his mind refusing to accept what his instincts had already begun to suspect. Then, without another word, he pushed past her and strode toward Ren's chambers, his heart pounding with a dread he could not yet name. He reached her door and threw it open, expecting to find her asleep, expecting to have time to demand answers, to fix whatever had gone wrong before it became irreversible. Instead, he found her slumped in her chair by the window, the empty cup resting on the table beside her, her face pale but strangely peaceful, a faint, gentle smile still lingering on her lips. The moment his eyes met her still form, the maid bond fled violently within him, a searing agony tearing through his chest as he felt her life slipping away through the connection they shared. It was as though the universe itself had waited until this exact moment to force him to understand what he had refused to acknowledge for months. The bond was real, and it was breaking, and he was losing her. Ren. His voice cracked as he rushed to her side, dropping to his knees beside her chair, his hands trembling as he checked for a pulse that grew weaker with each passing second. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, glassy and distant, though a flicker of recognition passed through them as she looked at him. "You came," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Stay with me," Kael said, his composure shattering entirely as he gathered her into his arms, desperation clawing at his chest. "Ivy. Corwin. Someone, help her, now." Ivy rushed into the room moments later, her face draining of color as she assessed the scene. She walked quickly, checking Ren's pulse, her breathing, the dilation of her eyes, though her trained instincts already told her what her heart refused to accept. "The dose is too strong," Ivy said, her voice breaking. "This isn't like the others. Someone gave her a massive amount tonight." "Fix her," Kael demanded, his voice raw with a desperation he had never allowed himself to feel before. "Whatever you need, whatever it costs, fix her." Corwin arrived moments later, his face grim as he examined the empty cup, confirming what Ivy already suspected. He walked alongside her, administering every countermeasure known to healers, though both understood deep down that the poison had progressed too far, too fast, to be reversed by any remedy within their reach. Ren's breathing grew shallow, her grip on Kael's hand weakening with each passing minute. He held onto her as though sheer will alone could keep her tethered to life, whispering words he had never allowed himself to say aloud before. "I was wrong," he said, his voice breaking. "I was wrong about everything. I let my pride blind me to what mattered, and I nearly cost you everything because of it. Please, don't leave. Not now. Not when I finally understand." Ren's eyes found his one last time, and despite the pain, despite the months of cruelty and cold silence, something soft and forgiving passed through her gaze. "It's all right," she whispered. "I'm not angry anymore. I just wanted to matter to someone." "You matter to me," Kael said fiercely, his voice cracking with the weight of a truth he had denied for far too long. "You matter more than the throne, more than the park, more than anything I ever thought I wanted." A faint, peaceful smile touched her lips, the same smile that had lingered there since she drank the poisoned tea, as though some part of her had already made peace with an ending she believed inevitable. "Then that's enough," she murmured. "That's enough for me." Her hand went still in his. Her chest rose one final time, then stilled entirely, the maid bond within Kael's chest tearing apart with an agony unlike anything he had ever experienced, a grief so total it felt as though his own heart had stopped beating alongside hers. Ivy checked for a pulse one last time, her own eyes filling with tears as she shook her head slowly, confirming what the silence in the room had already made clear. Kael remained kneeling beside her, holding her lifeless form against his chest, the weight of every cruel word, every cold dismissal, every wasted moment crashing down upon him all at once. He had spent months resenting a bond he never asked for, and now, in the space of a single unbearable night, he understood with devastating clarity exactly what he had lost. Outside the door, word of Ren's collapse spread quickly through the manor, drawing a small crowd of stunned pack members who watched in silence as their king knelt broken beside the woman he had spent so long refusing to accept. Draven arrived among the gathering crowd, his expression carefully arranged into practiced shock, though beneath the surface, cold satisfaction stirred at the sight of his plan reaching its intended conclusion. He had not expected the final dose to trigger such a public unraveling of the king's composure, but he told himself it changed nothing. The threat to his ambitions was gone. That was all that mattered. He did not yet know that Ivy's evidence remained intact, tucked safely within Corwin's possession, nor that Kael's grief would soon transform into a relentless search for the truth, one that would leave no shadow of the manor unexamined and no conspirator safely hidden. For now, the only sound in the room was Kael's ragged breathing as he held onto Ren's still form, grief and guilt intertwining into something far heavier than either emotion alone, a weight he suspected he would carry for the rest of his life. The bond that had once felt like an unwanted burden now felt like the greatest loss he had ever known, and as the first light of dawn began to creep through the frosted window, Kael Ashgrave made a silent, unbreakable vow. He would find whoever had done this. And he would ensure that Wren Calloway's death was not met with silence, but with justice. The manor had never felt so cold as it did in the days following Wren's death. Kael moved through the halls like a man carved from stone, his grief hardened into something sharper and far more dangerous, a relentless need for truth. He no longer cared about pride, about reputation, about the careful image of strength he had spent years building. He cared only about uncovering exactly how his mate had died, and who among his own people had allowed it to happen. Ivy and Corwin came forward immediately, presenting their evidence without hesitation. The concentrated sample of poison tea, the written testimony detailing weeks of suspicious symptoms, and the timeline of Wren's decline all painted a damning picture that Kael could no longer dismiss as pack politics or exaggerated concern. Silverwolf's bane does not appear in a manor by accident, Corwin said grimly, standing before Kael in the same study where he had once given his warning and been turned away. Someone here has access to rare poisons, knowledge of dosage, and a clear motive to see your mate removed. Kael's jaw tightened, memories of Draven's careful words echoing through his mind with new and horrifying clarity. Every conversation, every subtle suggestion, every moment of practice concern now revealed itself as calculated manipulation. "Bring me every servant who had access to her chambers," Kael ordered, his voice cold and final. "And bring me Draven. Now." The investigation moved swiftly once Kael committed himself fully to uncovering the truth. Servants who had feared retaliation for speaking out now came forward, describing subtle instructions from Draven regarding specific teas prepared for Wren's chambers, deliveries timed carefully to avoid scrutiny, and warnings to remain silent about any unusual observations. One young servant girl, trembling with fear, admitted that Draven had personally instructed her to deliver a particular batch of tea on the final night, insisting it be given directly to Wren without passing through the usual kitchen staff. The evidence mounted quickly, forming an undeniable chain that led directly back to Draven's ambition and his fear of losing his position within the pack's hierarchy. Elspeth, sensing the tide turning against her ally, distanced herself immediately, offering testimony that painted herself as an unwitting bystander rather than an active conspirator, though Kael's trust in her had already been irreversibly shattered. When Draven was finally brought before Kael in the same council hall where the mate bond had first snapped into place months earlier, he attempted to maintain his composure, offering weak denials and accusations against unnamed rivals seeking to undermine his position. But Kael had heard enough lies to last a lifetime. He raised a hand, silencing Draven's protest entirely. "You poisoned my mate," Kael said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight far more dangerous than any shout. "Slowly, deliberately, over weeks, while I stood by blind to what was happening beneath my own roof. You used my pride against me, knowing I was too consumed by resentment to see the truth in front of me." Draven's composure finally cracked. "She was never worthy of the throne," he spat, abandoning pretense entirely. "A human healer with no lineage, no power, no place among wolves. I did what was necessary to protect the pack's future. You did what was necessary to protect your own ambition," Kael said coldly. "And you will answer for it." The pack's laws regarding the murder of a true mate were absolute and unforgiving. Kael carried out justice himself, swift and final, ensuring that Draven's betrayal would never again threaten another innocent life within the manor's walls. Elspeth, though not directly responsible for the poisoning, was stripped of her position and exiled from the pack for her complicity in fostering the environment of cruelty that had made Wren's isolation and eventual death possible. But justice, however swift, did nothing to fill the hollow ache that had settled permanently in Kael's chest. He had spent months rejecting a bond he now understood he could never have replaced, and no punishment delivered to Draven or Elspeth could undo the months of cold silence, public humiliation, and quiet suffering Wren had endured before her death. In the weeks that followed, Kael found himself unable to return to the throne room without seeing the ghost of her presence in every corner, every empty seat, every quiet hallway she had once walked with careful, dignified steps despite the cruelty surrounding her. He visited the healer's wing often, speaking with Ivy about the young pack members Wren had quietly helped, the small kindnesses she had shown despite receiving none in return. He learned, piece by piece, the full measure of the woman he had dismissed so carelessly, and each new detail deepened the grief lodged permanently within his chest. Ivy shared stories of Wren's gentle patience with frightened children, her quiet determination to earn trust despite constant rejection, and the private moments of doubt she had confided only to those who showed her kindness. Corwin spoke of her resilience, her refusal to let cruelty define her, even when the entire manor seemed determined to see her as unworthy. Slowly, Kael began to understand that Wren Calloway had never been the mistake he once believed her to be. She had been exactly what the bond promised, a partner strong enough to endure hardship without losing her compassion, dignified enough to face humiliation without surrendering her spirit, and loving enough to forgive him even in her final moments, despite everything he had done to earn her resentment instead. Months later, on a quiet spring morning, Kael stood alone before a simple stone marker placed in the manor gardens, near the frozen fountain where he had once found her struggling to hide her weakening health. The frost had long since melted, replaced by soft green grass and the first blooming flowers of the season, a stark contrast to the coldness that had once defined their entire relationship. He knelt before the marker, placing a single white flower against the stone, the same flower Ivy had once mentioned Wren admired during quiet conversations in the healer's wing. "I failed you," he said softly, his voice carrying none of the coldness that had once defined his every interaction with her. "I failed to see your strength when it stood right in front of me. I failed to offer you the kindness you deserved from the very beginning. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to become worthy of the love you offered me, even when I gave you every reason to withhold it." The wind stirred gently through the garden, carrying the scent of blooming flowers and fresh spring air, and for a brief, quiet moment, Kael allowed himself to believe that somewhere, somehow, she could hear him. He rose slowly, his expression resolved rather than broken, carrying forward a new understanding of leadership that Wren's quiet strength had taught him even in death. He began reforming pack laws to protect future mates from the isolation and cruelty she had endured, ensuring that no bonded partner would ever again face rejection without recourse, nor suffer in silence without someone willing to listen. He elevated Ivy to head healer of the manor, honoring her loyalty and her relentless pursuit of truth even when speaking out had placed her in danger. He maintained close counsel with Corwin, valuing the wisdom of a healer who had tried to warn him before pride clouded his judgment. The throne Kael now ruled from felt different than it once had, no longer a symbol of unchecked power, but a responsibility he carried with humility and through devastating loss. He understood now that strength was not measured by cold dominance, but by the willingness to protect those who trusted you with their vulnerability, a lesson Wren had tried to teach him through quiet resilience long before her final breath forced him to finally listen. Each year, on the anniversary of her passing, Kael returned to the garden alone, kneeling before the same simple stone marker, renewing the vow he had made in the depths of his grief. He would rule not as the Alpha King who had been given an unwanted mate, but as the man who had failed to recognize true love until it was too late, carrying her memory forward as both a permanent reminder of his failure and an enduring purpose guiding every decision he made from that day forward. The pack that once mocked Wren Calloway's quiet kindness now spoke her name with reverence, remembering her not as an unwanted human healer forced into a bond she never asked for, but as the true mate whose gentle strength had ultimately transformed their king into the leader he had always been capable of becoming, though it had taken her greatest sacrifice to reveal it. And though she was gone, her presence lingered in every reform Kael enacted, every kindness he extended to those once overlooked, and every quiet moment he spent beside her memory in the garden where spring flowers now bloomed atop the frost that had once claimed her final days. She had smiled as she drank the poison meant to end her suffering, believing herself unloved and unworthy of the bond fate had given her. Only in her absence did the Alpha King finally understand the truth: she had been worthy of everything, and he had simply been too blind, too proud, and too late to see it while she still lived.